Okay, as we begin the second part of chapter one, general concepts of land use and investment, this is going to be just a very, very short clip. So I'm going to run through it fairly quickly. Let me remind you that anything in chapter one comes up in a later chapter, and you'll see down at the bottom of this slide that we will revisit this topic in the valuation chapter when we're talking about how to evaluate properties. So the first concept we're going to talk about is highest and best use. All property, all real property has what's known as a highest and best use. And what that means is the use of the property that will bring it the highest present value. Now, a couple of things about highest and best use is that it can change over time. Where my house, where my subdivision is sitting right now, used to be farmland. At some point, it became valuable enough that it made sense to build houses here. When you look in urban areas, land that used to just be less dense, they have now built high-rise buildings because the highest and best use has changed as the economy, as the market has evolved. So highest and best use, only one use at any given time, but that use may evolve over time. When we get to the valuation chapter, the slide that I have, or the graphic I have on the right, we'll talk more about this, but for it to be a highest and best use, it must meet the following criteria. It must be physically possible. In other words, why do you never see a Walmart on the side of a mountain? It's because there's not enough flat land to put a Walmart. It's not physically possible to do it. It must be legally permissible for it to be highest and best use. And by legally permissible, we don't mean that you're running a meth house or anything like that. We mean that it complies with the local zoning ordinances. Financially feasible. It must make sense to invest in it. And of course, it must be most profitable. That's what brings the highest and best use. And listen, there's no law that says you have to use property for its highest and best use. There are a lot of farmers in my area that could sell their land and create subdivisions. But having said that, they love having a farm. And that's what they're going to use it for as long as it is legal. And in most cases, they're grandfathered in. So they'll be able to use it like that as long as they choose to. Highest and best use. Also, when we're talking about land use and investment, we look at the idea of land use controls. Again, we will revisit this in a later chapter, but here's the thing that I want to put in your mind right now. When we talk about land use controls, listen closely. We're going to talk about the difference between public land use controls versus private land use controls. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of public land use controls. And Lisa, I want you to be prepared to give me the most common example of a private one in just a moment. I'm going to come back to you. Public land use controls would include things like zoning. For example, I live in an area that is zoned for single family residential. Well, why don't I put an apartment building here? I can make more money. I'm not allowed. It's not legally permissible because it's single family residential. That's an example of public land use control where the government has done it to us. Now, private land use controls, Lisa, give me an example of a private land use control.
Say like maybe your HOA covenants.
Yeah, your restrictive covenants. Isn't it funny that people will talk about, well, I don't want the government in my business. I don't want them restricting the use of my property, et cetera, et cetera. And then we turn around and we go and move into subdivisions that have restrictive covenants. Lisa, can you give me an example of a restrictive covenant in your neighborhood?
I would say maybe fences. In order to have a fence, it has to be approved, the type of fence, the color of fence, where the fence is going.
Yeah, I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I knew that you recently put up a fence in your backyard because your backyard is my backyard and I'm looking at it right now. So I knew that, and remember that we had to go through a process just to get that approved. That's because it's not because the city told us to, it's because our homeowners association required that. So land use controls, when we get to that chapter, keep it in your mind, public versus private restrictions, because then it will become pretty much understandable who is going to enforce it. Once you know whether it's public or private, you kind of get an idea of who's going to enforce those rules. And then real estate as an investment, we have a short chapter that'll come up later on this, but just a couple of quick things to hit you on. And this actually will probably get you really, really close to the answers on the exam. When we look at real estate as an investment, think about these things. Why would someone invest in real estate? Well, I invest in real estate because of cash flow. I want a return on my property, just like if I invest in anything, whether it be stocks or bonds or whatever. That's why you invest, is for a return, okay? Appreciation. I can't guarantee you that your property is going to appreciate, but real estate does have a good history of appreciation if you buy in the right areas. And then tax benefits. The federal government has seen to it that they want people to own property, so they actually give benefits for ownership of real property. One example of that is writing off the depreciation of your improvements on your property, which would include your house that you're renting out. They allow that to deduct that from your personal income. So those are some of the advantages associated with our real estate. But watch out for this for test purposes. One of the disadvantages of owning real property as an investment is that it's not liquid. And what I mean by that is I can't just go and turn it into cash. If I need cash and I own an investment piece of real estate, I'm going to have to find a buyer for it. I guess it's possible I could refinance it and pull some money out that way, but it's not as easy as a stock where I just pick up the phone, call my broker, he sells it, and I have cash in my bank account within 48 hours. Okay. So keep your eye on that. One of the disadvantages of owning real property as an investment is it's not liquid. Otherwise, it's a pretty dadgum good investment. And historically, it's done very well in comparison to other investments. Couple of quick questions here. So Lisa, are you ready for this? Now, Lisa, what if I tell you that this is a trick question? Would you like me to go ahead and give you the answer so that you don't miss it? Which of the following would be a public, focus on the word public, restriction to land use?
Subdivision regulations?
Oop, yeah, I didn't have the answers there. I'm sorry, I didn't prepare the answer for you, but you got the correct answer. The answer there is C, subdivision regulations. Now, I want you to look at this question real quickly, just so you understand why I wrote this question. When you're reading this question and you see the word subdivision, you might be thinking of restrictive covenants, but the key word there is actually regulation. So if you ever see the word subdivision regulation or subdivision ordinance, these are in fact public law. In other words, a subdivision regulation is the law that talks to you about how you can develop a subdivision. And what I mean by that is, think about the effect that subdivisions have on an area. If you used to grow 40 acres of soybeans and all of a sudden you start growing 40 acres of housing, think about how that affects the infrastructure. There's going to be more traffic on the roads, more kids to go to school. You need water, sewerage, trash pickup, all that type stuff. Subdivision regulations are public restrictions on whether you can even build a subdivision or not. By the way, when we look at this question, restrictive covenants and protective covenants are the exact same thing. Those are your homeowners association covenants. And deed restrictions actually are a private restriction as well. For example, if I were to convey my property to you and put a restriction in there and say, I'm selling you this property, but you can't park your work vehicle on that property because I don't want to make my property look bad. That's a private restriction. The government had nothing to do with that. We will revisit these topics in a later chapter. One more question on these. What is one of the primary disadvantages to investing in real estate? I spent a whole minute on this one, so go ahead and knock that one out for me, Lise.
Real estate is not liquid.
Yeah, clearly in this case, C is the answer. That's the disadvantage. As A says there, that's just a false statement. It tends to be a good investment compared to other options. Now, I have not mentioned the word leverage yet, so as long as we're here, if you don't mind, let me give you a short definition of leverage. When you think about leverage, think about using other people's money. Leverage means using other people's money, and all of us do it. When we buy real estate, typically we put a down payment of maybe 10, maybe 20% down, and then we borrow the rest from the bank. So it allows me to buy more property than what I could pay cash for. Leverage, that's going to be an important word as we go. And to say that real estate has few tax benefits is just flat out wrong as well. There are a lot of tax benefits associated with real estate. So the answer to that question is real estate's not liquid. That's the disadvantage. And that wraps up that short little chapter.